Welcome to Confessions of an Implementer, a podcast by Talent Harbor. We share unique stories of implementers and the companies they've transformed to give you a rare glimpse into the successes and the challenges of the system in action. I'm your host, Ryan Hogan. Let's jump in. Hey, joining me on the show today, we've got Jim Bygland, EOS implementer, and an amazing career full of integrator. Jim is an integrator through and through, and some of the concepts and the principles and the things that he has done throughout his career, helping visionaries, helping a team, becoming that glue, things like prioritization. How do you prioritize the tens, if not hundreds, of great ideas that are coming from organizations that may be great, but it may not be the time to actually implement? So how do you think through? How do you prioritize? How do you push back? Jim also shares some of his trials and tribulations. And so areas where he may not have gone in the right direction, and in retrospect, what he would have done differently in those situations. But just what an incredible recording episode. A lot of great advice, and hope you enjoy the show. Speaking of long careers, one of the things that you had talked about when we were on the discovery call was you were in a tech startup that was led by military entrepreneurs. What was that?
Well, it was a fintech before it's such a thing as fintech, and it was a company that was the actual CEO of the company. This is back when we used titles before EOS. And being a military company, it was really about vision. I mean, we had a vision, and every time we went out to implement our software into an organization, and this was banking software, financial software, we would go basically on a mission. We would get dropped off on the company airplane. We'd have 4.5 days to get that bank converted from their old software to the new software. And it truly was the clarity of a good vision and mission came together. We didn't want to let our teammates down. I mean, we were all 22 to 25 year old, probably didn't have any business taking over a bank for 4.5 days and converting software on them, but we did it. We came in our suits and had our briefcases. We looked official. And by the end of the 4.5 days, whatever it took, they were now running on our software. And typically those were 75 to 90-hour weeks that we would run, getting them cut across. So it was a fun experience, but it truly was the value of a good mission. Nobody wanted to let anybody down.
Have you noticed, because I'm sure you've worked for other organizations that didn't necessarily have a leadership team that had military backgrounds. Was there something different about, and obviously this is a little bit near and dear to my heart, being in the Navy, but what are some of the differences that you had between organizations where it was not kind of that military experience, military background?
Different times, I'll be honest. I've been very fortunate through my career. Most of my experiences, I've had fantastic mentors. We've been able to put together great teams to be able to achieve what we wanted to. Sometimes though, I've been in organizations where the leadership, for lack of a better term, is a little bit self-centered. It's about them. And so those organizations are a little bit tougher because you're always kind of second guessing what truly is our mission here. Because we might have a plan when we walk out of the meeting, but 4 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours later, the plan changes. There's a meeting after the meeting, or there's a thought process that happens somewhere along the lines like, whoa, we just took a 90-degree turn here from what happened. It's just a lot of wasted effort. So,
and were your roles a lot of the things that you're already talking about remind me very much of the integrator role? Has that historically kind of been where you find your sweet spot in organizations?
Yeah, that was me. I was the guy who liked to make the trains run on time. I was the guy who put together kind of the back end. My back end, or my background, is technology and operations. And so that's typically the seat that I would fill. Sometimes at the integrator level in EOS language, but always on the executive team, making sure that we're rowing in the right direction. And, some groups were definitely more successful than other groups, but it was always about figuring out what that mission was, what the vision was, and where we wanted to go.
Got it. And what, like, the helping to keep those trains running on time, like, what has been some of the the challenges throughout your career of like being able to effectively integrate? Because I'm sure some of that has to do with the team that you're working with, the vision that you're following, and some of these, you were talking about back channeling, this notion of after the meeting's complete, whether we call them quarterly pulses or the level 10 meeting, but all the back channeling and side conversations that are happening where decisions are kind of being unraveled. What are some of the challenges that you've dealt with in that role?
Probably the biggest one that I can recall is we took over a data center. It was in a need of management turnaround. And so we came in and we brought in a team of consultants. I was with a consulting company at the time, and everybody was experts. Everybody had, decades of experience. They were good at their jobs. But we had been working in this particular data center from about 7 in the morning to 11 at night for months on end. And we were in a passionate, version of a level 10 meeting trying to decide, and we weren't getting consensus. We weren't moving it forward. And this is one of those cringeworthy moments that you kind of look back on, and it kind of shapes you, because I tried to use title power to push it over the finish line. That does not work. It was one of those things that still sticks with me to today, because it was like, basically cuss word, we're moving this direction. And everybody just you saw the whole room shut down at that instant. And it was a case of, it took actually months to pull that team back together after one just kind of heated moment of frustration.
Yep. What were some of the tactics or strategies that you used to help kind of rebuild cohesiveness?
Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it really was just getting back on the mission. What were we trying to do here? We were trying to build a great data center. We had a bunch of unhappy customers. We had regulators who were knocking on our door, and that's why we had come in to take this thing over. And so we had to put the pieces back together to achieve happy customers again. And so we just had to kind of go back through. I had to kind of come back with my hat in my hand and eat some crow, because it was on me totally. It was my bad. And you learn from that. It still sticks with me to this day.
And so it's interesting, because one of the philosophies behind EOS and this whole visionary and integrator role is that the integrator is the tiebreaker. And as a visionary, sometimes that's been hard for me to swallow, because I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, I feel like that should eventually come to me. And how it's been explained is that, the idea of same page meetings, the idea of perfect alignment between the visionary and the integrator, the integrator kind of naturally, instinctively knows the right path, or as a team, as a duo team, the direction we should be going. And so one of the things you just said there was, this notion of title power. And to me, that sounds like you were trying to be that tiebreaker, you weren't getting to the consensus. So how should an integrator kind of deal with that?
Well, in that particular case, this was way before EOS, and we had not really, given, again, that we were working a lot of hours and we were getting kind of a little bit frayed, we hadn't probably had our beginner's mindset on quite as well as we should have, and sought to understand. It was just frustration. Everybody was hot. We should have backed away in hindsight and kind of regrouped to rethink about it and just slow down. We were trying to, or I was trying to force something through that shouldn't have been forced through, and go back to that mindset of understanding. You're talking on the topic of visionary and integrator. And to me, the integrator is a person who is there to execute on the visionary's desires. And you guys have a lot of phenomenal ideas. You have some that probably aren't quite as good, but a lot of them are good. And so we have to discern which ones we can prioritize in on which quarter, what we're working on, and kind of go from there. But, what I tell my teams is if the integrator surprises the visionary too many times, it's not a good fit. Their same page meeting, they should be kind of seeing around those corners, figuring out what's coming at them, figuring out what the things are of how they're going to put the dominoes in place for how they're going to fall. And, we've all read the books. We know there are teams that have had 2 and 3 and 4 integrators before you finally get rocket fuel. And so, yes, I totally agree that the integrator makes a call, but it's in very tight conjunction with the visionary and executing what that visionary is seeing. I think a lot of the friction that comes into place is bad same page meetings. They're just not having the discussions that they need to figure out what has to happen.
And I don't I don't think, admittedly, I don't think I've ever had a great same page meeting. I think the integrators that I've worked with in the past, it was more, I guess what I mean by that is more of like a structured same page meeting. Like I feel like we've always been on the same page, but it's because we talk so much about what's happening, the direction. Like what goes into a great same page meeting?
From my vantage point, it really is, it's a relationship. It's going back to Lencioni's vulnerability-based trust. You're kind of two halves of the same coin. And so starting at the relationship level, if you've got something going on in your personal life or health-wise or whatever, either direction, that starts it. So everybody kind of understands where they're making the decisions from. The other thing is there can't be any of that threat of entitlement or titles. If I don't like you, I'm going to get rid of you type of approach. That whole feeling has to go away, and it has to be 100% trust that we're in this to win this. We're in it to build a great company. We're in it to figure out what is the next step. And sometimes the integrator does have to come back and say, okay, I love the idea. However, you know what? We got these 7 rocks that we're working on right now. Great idea. Can that hold until next quarter? Now, if it's, and I'm sure as a visionary, you've had some ideas that you've had to move on. They were timely. And so sometimes you do have to say, we're going to shift gears and we're going to execute and take advantage of this. But that's the exception, not the rule.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, sometimes it takes 4 integrators to find the right one. Do you think that's more of a product of just crazy visionaries and like not a good relationship, or do you think there's like a fundamental trust issue that hasn't been able to been overcome yet?
I would say it's a fundamental trust issue. I see that pretty much with all my teams. I want to make sure that they read rocket fuel and they take the assessment. Some visionaries, they built these companies from the ground up. It was their baby. They know all the moving parts. And now they're bringing in this person who's going to take over the day-to-day and start to move it forward. That's uncomfortable. I had one visionary. It took him about 1.5 years to kind of get his head back on straight to figure out where he was adding value to the company. Because before it was turning the dials, it was doing those things. And it was a case of he had to figure out that no, my new role is really strategic development. I'm going to find the new street corner or the next business we're going to acquire. And that's where my value is. It was truly on the big relationships, on the culture. But it took him 1.5 years. Luckily, in his case, his integrator was a son. So there wasn't a firing there. But they had some good heart-to-hearts, and there was a lot of discussion figuring out what the true superpower of that visionary was. And once they figured that out, they've grown about 4x now in the last 1.5 years. They've just exploded, and it's fun to watch. But a lot of it, I do think it's are you ready for it? And sometimes you're not.
Yeah, sometimes you're not ready to be told no, or you've got bigger things or more pressing things to worry about, or your idea sucks. When I think back to a lot of my successful integrator visionary relationships, there was a pre-existing relationship there. There was already some sort of commonality. And it's interesting because like when you just talked about, even though there was tough conversations between the father and the son, there's ultimately a relationship, an inescapable relationship that is there. And so like, they're always going to, for the most part, they're always going to find a path. Hopefully, if nothing more than to save the relationship. Where have you seen like successful visionary integrators where they're just running a normal recruiting process, and how does that relationship get built kind of the right way out of the gates, outside of pre-existing relationships?
That one's tougher. There, I'd have to say you better start looking at some of the profiling tools, whether it's Colby or DISC or Predictive Index, to figure out what is a match. And like with anything within the accountability chart, figure out truly what you're looking for. What are those 5 roles that you truly want that integrator to do? Now, yes, we have some pre-figured out ones, but what do you want that person to really do for you? And a lot of folks, they kind of skip that step. Visionaries like, I'm going to hire an integrator. Let's go do it. And if they don't spend the time figuring out exactly what they're looking for and figuring out if they're ready for it, I see that as the most conflict. again, the relationship ones that have lived and have grown and nurtured together pre-EOS, probably the ones that are the strongest out of the gate. Not saying that they can't be developed, but it takes time. I would say most of the time it's probably a year and a half, 2 years of figuring out what everybody's going to do.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which is spot on, is this notion of prioritization. And that could be seen as like saying, no, like we're not going to do that right now. Great idea, or just terrible idea. We're never going to do that. But like you, as someone that has been in this integrator role, which I'm sure many of times not only has had to prioritize, but also say like, that's like great, but we can't do that right now. How do you think through the prioritization of like what the organization should be doing right now, and then what should go on we used to call it the parking lot. And so like there's a whole bunch of great ideas, and the great ideas we would throw in the parking lot. That was mostly for the creative team. The parking lot in a true kind of EOS structure is you just put it on the long-term issues. You look at it each quarter and you say, is now the right quarter to do that? But how would you think through the prioritization of everything that the organization had to accomplish?
Well, I'll go back in my companies. I had 3 core values, and I've used them over and over. One of the core values is the answer is never no. And what that comes in handy is, yeah, that's a great idea. I love it. But what are you truly trying to accomplish? Help me understand what you're trying to develop. Because so often an idea comes out and it's not clearly articulated, or something comes in from a client and they're asking for something and the sales rep says, no, we don't do that. It's like, no, the answer is never no. Let's get that beginner's mindset. Let's start asking the questions. Truly, what are they looking for? And so that's one of the techniques I've always used, is to fall back on that core value to figure out what they're truly trying to accomplish. Because, sometimes there is a root cause issue that we're trying to figure out. My second core value was no customer impact. So whatever we did in the companies, again, coming from a tech standpoint, we never wanted to impact. And so we were always very well executed. And so if something was going to interrupt that execution and not allow me to succeed or potentially cause customer impact, we came to a hard stop, because we don't do that. If you put your customer at risk, they're going to leave you. And so we made sure we never had customer impact. And the last one was communicate. And so, because again, what went along with that is we are better as a team. Over communicate, talk amongst your people, figure out how we're going to get this out to achieve the other 2 core values. And those are the 3 that I always kind of came back to in my organizations, is to figure out how we did that. And then at times work with the visionary to figure out how we're going to balance all of those out. And typically when you have those discussions, you typically can build a better product or a better outcome, because we now then have our clear vision. We know when we're going to execute on that vision, and now we move forward to achieve it.
And how did you start? Because you were an integrator before. I'm sure you read Rocket Fuel, and you were already doing many of these things. Like, how did you get into being an integrator, whether it was a COO role or president role or whatever your seat was on the executive team?
I don't really know, to be honest with you. I just kind of fell into organizations that, project management and timing and execution was just paramount, and I loved it. And that was where when I got into those moving components, that's what I really loved. Now, did I have visionary traits? Yeah, but it's going to be within my vertical of technology. How do we do things better, smarter, faster? How do we put these pieces together? And that's where we played quite a bit in that space. But again, it was always objectives that match the outcome of what the corporation is trying to do. Why were we putting into this technology? Well, we're trying to grow, and we're not trying to do customer impact and all those types of things. And it's just how I was wired. When I take the personality test, my personality test is either right at the line or right at the center of the quadrant, whatever you want to say, because depending on what role I was in, I would drift into analytics, or I'd drift into visionary, I'd drift into, whether it was social needs or whatever it was, I would kind of move around on that. And so I was always very close to the centers of any of those personality tests. And I think it probably bode me well through the different companies I have been with.
And when you think back, like pre-Rocket Fuel and you doing a lot of these glue type roles where you're bringing the organization, making sure the organization is staying focused, like what type of media or content or books, like what were you consuming at that point to be able to help you think through these types of things?
I always loved Lencioni, and I always loved Collins. Collins, I think his latest redone book, BE 2.0, is a great visionary handbook. That was, I think, his first book that he had ever done. And it was all done based on theory when he was out at Stanford. And then he went back through during COVID and he put in new chapters or additions based upon everything that he did. Good to Great, How the Mighty Fall, etc. And he wove all those back in, and it's just a very powerful book. But I had been a Collins fan for a long, long time just because it was so clear. And again, though, I had really good mentors. And it goes back to my earliest fintech is that particular company, they felt they hired smart people. We didn't invest in a lot of outside education. It was like, you're smart, figure it out. And so we ended up writing software from scratch, figuring out working with the client to see what they needed, but we didn't do a lot of studying. And so that mindset of just figure it out stuck with me. Whether it was in technology or operations, it's like, okay, let's put our heads together and move forward. Just like what we talk about in the OS journey is, 95% of the answers, 98% of the answers are in the room. It's the client's business. They know it. It's just you got to figure out what thread you want to pull to get them all going the same direction. And so it probably was a form of facilitation a long time ago of trying to build these teams. And that was probably one of the things that I grew a strength to, and that was building teams, putting people together, getting them in the right seat. Now, I made lots of mistakes. My biggest mistake was always keeping people around too long. They were really great people. They had great core values. I loved them, but they just weren't good at their seat. And I was always trying to fix them, and I kept them around too long. I probably have half a dozen examples of that. But I finally got a mentor, and she helped me out quite a bit. She was head of our HR group, and she and I became good friends. And she basically said, Jim, if you give them your time, tools, and training, you can look yourself in the mirror the day you're going to fire them. You've done everything you needed to do. And so that was kind of the thing I always did is when I had to move somebody out, did I give them my time? Did they have the right tools? Did I train them to do the job how it needed to be done? And if I could answer yes to all three of those, then it became a much easier discussion. Now, did I keep people around too long after that? Yeah, I still did. But, that's just part of being human.
Yes, you nailed it. I was going to say the same thing. Like it's just as humans, it's very hard, and also outside perspective. Like the other thing that I've noticed, especially with some of the things I'm working on today, is like being able to go into organizations and look what's going on. It's so easy for me to see like where they're going wrong and what they should be doing. But it's so hard for us, like being in the day to day, to say like these are the decisions I need to make. I'm assuming that's the human nature behind this.
It is, and that's just it. We walk in, a lot of my clients, and you've heard lots of different people talk about this, but you can walk in and you can see, okay, I got a 6-member leadership team. That person over there, they will make it. But there's nothing we really can say other than set the right rocks, help them get to where they need to go, and they'll figure it out. And at some point in time, the light bulb will come on, and maybe there's a better seat for them, or sometimes you got to move them out.
If for someone that's a visionary or someone that's sitting in the integrator role at this point, and like what signs should they be looking for? Like what affirmations, like what are the different signals that they're receiving where they're like, I need to make a change here? Like, are there things that they can look for early on to help with the affirmation of like, a decision is needed at this point?
To me, it's always just rock completion and numbers. If your data component's strong, if you're seeing the scorecard, if their names are tied to it, that's a piece, or if the rocks aren't getting done. In the quarterly debriefs, when you start listening to these folks and they start talking about all the reasons this didn't get done or that didn't get done, that's when you have to start pulling the thread back to see, was it a good rock? Was it the right rock? Was it truly smart? And if it wasn't, then you kind of have to say, okay, well, that one does that need to go on the issues list? Let's talk about that a little bit more. But to me, it's just taking the blinders off and really seeing, are they executing? Are they delivering? Are they accountable for what they said they'd be accountable for? To me, that's probably the first sign I see is just an accountability problem. There's somebody else's issue. Again, coming up from a tech side, and I realize this probably sounds pretty hard, but we took control. One of my favorite books, by the way, is Extreme Ownership. But we would take control of the vendors. It's like, okay, one of the last things I would always do before we signed a big contract was we would have a no surprises meeting. And so we would sit down with our team, would sit down with their team. And even though the contract is all T's crossed and I's dotted, we would go through and say, okay, here's what we're going to end up with, correct? Layman's language. You're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to have it by this date, right? We're all good. And so that could be an hour meeting or it could be an all-day meeting. Well, we called it no surprises. And there was enough people in that room that everybody knew that if we had a problem somewhere down the road, we were going to go back and say, no, we had this discussion. This is what you guys said you were going to do. This is what we said we're going to do. Let's figure it out. Let's handle it. And so we would always take over and drive accountability. To me, it's not, well, I can't do anything about the vendor. Well, yeah, you can. Better scope of work to figure out how you handle that vendor to get what you desire.
And was this no surprise meeting? Was this before or after you had discovered EOS?
Long before. And the reason was I had too many surprises that's not what the contract said. Okay. And so we just got to the point where I'd have 5 or 6 of my key team members and they'd have their key team members, including the salesperson. And we would just go through and figure it out. And the other thing is the types of vendors that we dealt with typically in my companies, they had to kind of match up to our core values. Even though this was pre-EOS and there wasn't, 4 or 5 core values, they heard about my 3 core values. Hey guys, here's what's going to happen. And they had to kind of embody that a little bit because if they weren't going to do that, we knew it wasn't going to be a great relationship. And so we kind of shied away from those guys.
So what you just said, I am learning the hard way right now. Bill Huter had said something a little similar to this as well. And it took actually doing it to understand what that meant. But the alignment of core values is incredibly important. And I think, for companies that are in the early days, you're just yes to everything. And then you very quickly realize that it was never going to be a fit. You knew it wasn't going to be a fit. And now everybody's lives are miserable, not just yours, but the clients as well, because it's not nobody's meeting each other's expectations. Everybody's on different pages. I 100% agree. And now getting into B2B, living through a lot of those experiences.
Well, anything a person has ever done, you've always taken on clients or employees or fill in the blank. You had kind of a gut feel it wasn't right, but you either fell into what we call WBS, the warm body syndrome. I need somebody in that seat. Or, you know what? I need that client. They got a big paycheck. And so we will take them on, even though there's some pretty big gaps of our offering. And it's just not fun doing that. And when you can get to the point where you don't have to do that and you can go slow and say, no, here's what we do, it's so much better.
Yeah. Do you use that today? As you're doing EOS implementation and getting clients and things like that, are you still using some of these principles today of alignment and in how you see life? And
oh yeah. And I broke the rules too. When you first start your practice, you're trying to get clients because you get so much better as you are exposed to situations and working with various types of clients. I'm a strong believer that you learn in every situation, good and bad, but you want the right type of client. And so now I'm much more focused on very intentional types of discussions hey guys, this is a hard journey that we're going to go on together. It's going to take 2 years, most likely. This is what's going to happen through this process. And if this isn't you, let's don't start. It's not where we want to be. And when I've been able to do that, which has been pretty consistent, the outcomes are so much better. I mean, they're mentally ready to go. They're bought in. They know what they're up against. And the obstacles disappear much quicker. So you kind of get down the whine factor a lot quicker because okay, yep, it's just an issue. Let's solve it.
I've always heard this notion of the graduation, the 2 years in the graduation. We could never bring ourselves to do that. The outside perspective, even though we had graduated and we had, we feel like we had learned a lot. The outside perspective that implementers bring to the game and the level of accountability, it's just different. Like it's different than what the visionary, the integrator can do. Like we can hold people accountable, we can do a lot of different things, but we all have blind spots. And like to the point earlier of now being able to go into organizations and like see kind of the mechanics and how things are working, it's like all of these things need to change. It's so incredibly powerful to have somebody, even after graduation, that can come in and just help put on quarterly pulses and the annual planning.
Yeah, my ratio is probably about 40% graduate. I truly want them to graduate. 60% don't. And it really depends upon the composition of the team. If you have teams that have those passionate L10s and they're willing to have almost knockdown, drag out type discussions within those four walls, but walk out as friends, those companies seem to do fine. The companies that tend to posture or wrap a little bit, again, one of the terms, and I probably shouldn't use this term, but I call it Midwest nice. Everybody here in the Midwest, we're nice folks. We love each other. I mean, we'll do anything for anyone, but we really won't do that hard conversation. And so that's the part, and I think a lot of implementers now are spending time on radical candor. If you truly care about somebody, you have to challenge them. Expose that blind spot so they can see their shortcoming. That's the thing I loved about EOS when I discovered it was the intentionality. I mean, we're telling you what you have to be, what you have to do to be good in your seat. We're telling you how you fit in the organization with the core values. We're giving you processes to follow. We're giving feedback loops in there with the quarterly conversations. Everything's very intentional. And so you're taking away all the BS. It's like, and part of this, where this comes back to is one of the companies is I did have the CEO, and this is pre-EOS. If I ever started to whine, he said, I don't think I held you down to take this job. It is called work for a reason. And so he just had a good way of putting you back to it, getting your headspace back on square. And so that's kind of what I fall back on is to start asking those questions of how do we get their heads screwed back on straight? How do we get them to have those tough conversations? Because this one client, I'm just thinking about them, I was just with them a couple of weeks ago. Again, they wrap everything. They're just such a nice team. And they're so nice. They solve issues, but it takes too long. And one of them at the end, he said, why do we get through so much more when you're with us than when you're not? And we dove into it. It's like, well, you guys put a lot of wrappers on stuff. You put a lot of context to stuff. That particular discussion, we actually had to shut the visionary off because he loved providing context. And I said, okay, I'm going to stop you. Team, do you need this context? Or are you guys all up to speed on what the topic is? They all went thumbs up. Okay, we don't need to spend any time there. Let's move on to discussion. We just went around the table and we just tightened up what they were doing. They were in a habit of providing a lot of information. It could border on politicking, but I think really it was just more a high detail person who wanted to make sure everybody had every tidbit of information they needed, and they didn't need that.
When you talked a little bit earlier about this idea of knockdown, drag down fights, and like, everybody comes in, there's passion, and everybody's fighting theoretically for the greater good of the organization, and then they're able to walk away as friends. I'm sure you've seen a variety of these types of heavy debates during sessions and things like that. Like, what's the difference between healthy and unhealthy? Because I think a lot of teams they want to engage and they want to have these knockdown, drag down fights. How can you tell like when it's starting to cross the line of like, all right, well, now we're in an unhealthy level of engagement?
Typically there, it's just, when you start seeing the little openings of personal attacks, that's typically my warning sign that I'll kind of say, okay, time out. Most teams are pretty respectful though, but I do think that level of discussion, because we're not wired that way. We're not wired to have those types of debates in most meetings when we walk into them. And I truly think that takes really about a year and a half to really start to develop that trust level with each other. So they know that, hey, they're not out for my job. They're not here to undermine me. We're all going for this one thing. And so go from there. A lot of my clients, I do have to work with them on seeking to understand, because too many folks, they're thinking about the rebuttal. versus actually listening. And so there's some tips I've been focusing on lately to really try to help my teams to get that curiosity, to get to understand where that person is coming from. And sometimes it may be a legitimate place, sometimes it may not be, but at least we're exposing it to help clarify to move this thing on.
Go ahead. Well, I was gonna say, well, you brought it up, so I have to ask, what are those tips? Like, how do you help people become curious? How do you help people engage?
Well, one I just learned about a month ago. I was at a seminar, and a guy was doing a breakout session, and what he did is he said, okay, when you respond to your person that you're working with, your question has to start with the last letter of the last word that they said. So that way you knew you listened to every word right down to the last letter. And so your question of how you asked your clarifying question or comeback was from the last letter of that. And I thought that was a really cool idea. You know, when you're put on the spot like that, you have to think about what was the last letter and how in the hell do I form a question out of that? You know, it makes you think a little bit. It makes you take a pause to formulate that question. And that was one I just thought it was cool. It worked well, but it really made you think a little bit. You know, we've used talking sticks or talking bats, depending on the team, just to make sure folks are listening and they're listening to understand.
When you put in the talking sticks or the talking bats, at times, will you hand those to people that are not talking to help them engage, or is it just this person that's talking and now everybody listen?
Who's ever got it, the theory is who's ever has it, they have the floor. But if they're pontificating, if they're politicking, then yes, we'll help them move the stick on. But typically that slows everybody down to think about it a little bit.
Okay. I love the last letter, by the way, and I wrote it down in all caps because I want to bring that into the show, and try and develop questions from the last letter statement. So I'm gonna try that. One of the things that you talked about a little bit was this idea of like the personal attacks, and so when you see it getting personal, is this like when someone's using the language of like you instead of like, I don't know, something that has to do with the company? Like, are there things that are happening in that moment where it's not about the KPI or for the betterment of the company? It's more about that person as an individual or their capacity within the role that they fill.
Yeah, it goes personal from a standpoint of their behaviors, their attitudes, their work ethic, whatever it is. It is now has transcended from the problem to them. And that's where you just got to pull it back up and say, okay. And sometimes the person may be the problem, but there's different ways to say that and say, okay, did we do a good job of IDSing? Are we truly at the root cause here? Why did that occur? Why did that occur? Why did that occur? Et cetera, to get down to the root to see what it is. And I would say that probably is when you see it go personal, because somebody in the room wasn't open and honest. They didn't state the true root cause. But during the discussion, that root cause starts to come out in some way, shape, or form. And if it's a person problem, you'll see it. Now, I had a team down in Alabama. They just had one guy who was a jerk. He always went personal. That was his makeup. He had gotten away with it for years. And it was a case of, time out. That's not acceptable for what we're doing here. Because it was a good team. It's just he was a bully and he was getting away with it.
And when did you discover EOS? So you had a long, amazing career where you were already sitting in the integrator role. And then how did you discover it? And then I'm sure you had this moment of like, holy crap, I've been doing this my whole career.
Came across it with a oil and gas company, or the industry related to oil and gas. And we were putting analytics in, and we were kind of had an early mover advantage. But we had a group of data scientists. We had a group of just the rank and file from 20 years, and they weren't talking. I mean, we were losing our first mover advantage because we had two companies and we were trying to make them one company. So we found EOS, we implemented EOS. And in that particular case, when we implemented it, within about 60 days, we had the leadership team as one. But another 6 months, we had it pushed out into the organization. Now, it worked wonderful. It was fun to watch. It was fun to be a part of. We learned some great lessons. We also learned that folks don't want to pay for analytics in this particular field. But the other thing is that it really taught me the psychographic component of the leadership team. In this particular case, we had a majority owner. He was still owner. He wasn't really an employee, and he had all the answers. And those just aren't real good. It's not a good fit. But I saw the power of EOS, and you're right. I had that holy crap moment that, I read the book on a vacation, and I was like, man, this is great. Went through it. It's like, okay, this will help us. And it started out great. But then again, old tendencies came back. It wasn't the journey that we all wanted to go on together. And so we went different directions, and I went off and became an EOS implementer. Haven't looked back.
Yeah. And do you have a like niche focus? Like I know some implementers out there are like law offices or family businesses. Like have you found, because your background is a lot of banking and technology and all these other things. Like have you found a niche, or are you like any client that fits with my core values? Let's roll.
I'm the latter. I love learning. And again, when you boil it down, it's the same problems. It's numbers, it's people, it's process. When you start ripping the layers back, the companies aren't that different. Yeah, the nomenclature might be a little bit different. The structure of how they put together their accountability chart might be a little bit different. But I was fortunate.
I think Sherry Kuhn and I were talking yesterday, and we were talking about the companies that don't want it, and it's almost like a cult, right? Like once you read traction and implement it, you're like, God, life just became so much easier, and all you want is everybody else to understand how easy their lives can then be. But they got to want it. It's an easy process to put into place. It's a very hard process to get the consistency and do the work. But it always boggles my mind of like, if you implement and do the work, like the machine just turns. Is there, do you take clients from all over the United States, or do you focus regionally? How do you have that structure at this point?
Most of my clients are from central Oklahoma to central Missouri. I do have a few outside of that, but I'm at a stage where I don't mind picking all over the country. If it's a business that fascinates me and I want to see about it, okay, I'll hop on a plane. Not a problem, because I am getting referrals now, and it just depends where those referrals come from. And that's really where most of my business comes from. I don't want to let them down, so I'll jump on planes or drive. I'll drive up to typically 4 hours. Otherwise, it's a plane trip.
Last question, actually second to last question. If someone wants to get a hold of you, they've listened to this podcast and they're like, what an amazing integrator, a career full of integration, and like he would be amazing as an implementer for our company. How would they find you?
Just go to the EOS website, go to my microsite, or they can catch me at jim.bygland@eosworldwide.com.
Awesome. And then for are you in the system also as Jim in the EOS? Because I know there was a James in there too, and I think I might have been sending wrong emails. So it's Jim.
It goes either way. They can go James or Jim. The God-given name was James, but been Jim my whole life.
There you go. Last question for real this time. If you could have coffee, tea, wine, beer, your drink of choice with any EOS implementer, who would it be?
With another EOS implementer, probably Mark O'Donnell. MOD. I've been on calls with him, and I mean, he is just a cool guy. His wealth of experience and the way he looks at things is just pretty phenomenal.
That's awesome. I'm actually interviewing Mark in 2 weeks, so it should make for an incredible conversation. We'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Good ones. Sherry, she is a sweetheart. She is a superstar. And I mean, what she does is phenomenal.
That's why I'm happy to be back in Seattle at this point, because she's like 20 minutes up the road from me. So she's on vacation right now, but we're going to get together later this month. So very excited about that.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, Jim, thank you so much for coming on. This is, I've got a whole page of notes now, and I don't know how I'm going to consolidate this for an intro. But I know I got a lot of value. I know the audience will get a lot of value, and just the work that you've done, both as an integrator and an implementer, huge. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Ryan. Have a great 4th of July.
Thanks. You too.
Okay, bye.
Confessions of an Implementer is brought to you by Talent Harbor. To find out more about Talent Harbor and our fractional services and talent search solutions for businesses, visit talentharbor.com. And then make sure to search for Confessions of an Implementer in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And on behalf of the team here at Talent Harbor, thanks for listening.